It's a great pleasure to come to Vivekananda Institute. You know, Vivekananda is someone, Swami Vivekananda is someone that one has grown up inspired by in so many different ways, but also about humanism and the ethos of one world, one family. So in that context, I think this theme of multilateralism is really important to focus on, and very rightly, India's G20 presidency has prioritized it as one of the 6 priority or themes. I want to begin. I know most of you probably are not what we call in the diplomatic service multilateralists. So let me begin with a little anecdote. When I first went to, I know you mentioned my different avatars in the UN and Foreign Service, but one of the avatars, or 2-3 other avatars, were also in 1981. I first went to Geneva as a first secretary dealing with human rights and some part disarmament. And I found that, and I had been a bilateral, I thought I was a very important undersecretary dealing with very important relationship, Pakistan. So that was the bilateral hardcore, brief that I had, and very exciting one. And then from there you go to a multilateral forum. So after 2 months or so, I went to my permanent representative at that time, Mujkund Dubey, and I said, look, I'm feeling very disillusioned already and demotivated. So tell me, what is multilateralism all about? So then he was a great believer, and I must say, whatever I will say today, I speak from the anguished heart of a believer in multilateralism. So what he said was, you have to believe in the power of ideas to change the world. And believe that the seeds that you sow through a resolution, through an interaction, through discussions with at that time there were lesser countries, but 193 countries, and you come to some conclusion, you set up some norms and standards, they will benefit your country and the world. So that's the belief with which you have to go forth into multilateralism. So I just wanted to give you that context. So let me begin by saying, as has been mentioned, and Ambassador Bhatia has very eloquently and very comprehensively indicated what are India's priorities and what the context in some ways of multilateralism in that. But the theme of reformed multilateralism to make it current and fit for purpose for the 21st century. That is the theme. And it's in advancing what? In advancing the 4 major projects of humanity. What are they? Peace and security in terms of preventing conflict, early warning on conflict, peacemaking, keeping, and building. That's one project. The second project is human rights and democracy. And I think Master Bhatia referred to that, India brand, but also globally, it's a project, democracy and human rights. The third is humanitarian response, disaster response, and that crisis response. The fourth, I think you rightly mentioned, Dr. Gupta, that SDGs and the Sustainable Development Goals, now that the world has this template to achieve, these goals to achieve, they are indispensable, and they are humanities projects, which must be therefore taken forward. And these are all multilaterally conceived, multilaterally dealt with projects, but also they can benefit from a more effective and reformed multilateralism. Now, the global public goods, and I want to mention this concept of global public goods and global public bads. So the global public goods, these are global public goods, and within that there are specific elements of global public goods: health, water, other education, and sustainable energy. So all of that. So these global public goods must be conceptualized, and this is, I think, India's vision. You were asking global south, but it is also humanity's vision that these goods must be conceptualized, governed, and delivered effectively, impartially, inclusively for the benefit of all of humanity, in keeping with India's G20 slogan, the idea that one earth, one family, one future vision. So, in particular, as has been said, it must benefit the global south. And developing countries and least developing countries who represent, and I think I want to just quickly refer to the China question. I think China has moved north. And so I would really talk about 2/3 of the world's population now is the global south. And so we have to take care of their interests, their needs, and their ability to benefit from these global projects. So, and it is the aspirational humanity that is struggling to eliminate poverty, achieve accelerated economic growth and well-being, and sustainable development for all, and leaving no one behind, which is also another Indian, what shall we say, DNA, which is Sarvodaya and Antodaya, leaving no one behind, picking everyone up and bringing everybody's well-being and development. So now just a little bit of a global south background. The global south moniker, and I think something has been mentioned by Master Bhatia about the G77, the etymology of all of that. But I just want to mention this whole global south because it's relevant to the reform agenda. So the moniker of global south, used from 2000 onwards in contradistinction to the global north, epitomized in G7, it marked the increased participation and share of developing countries in global trade, investment, and world economy, technology, global governance, and norm setting. So that had already begun. So from moving, in the 90s and 80s and 70s to be demanders without any power, there was now increased capacity and power to have a voice and to make that voice heard. So that is what is the difference, the centering of the South rather than the bordering of it. There used to be this core periphery theory, center periphery theory before of Raul Prebisch. So now many more countries were entering the center. So that global South is not only the countries of the South, they are in all stages of development. And it is not only those countries of the South who are LDCs or in especially disadvantaged positions, because those are, of course, very much the ones to be most benefited from the world order and multilateral system, but also the others who have who still, of course, are developing countries because of per capita income or other elements, but they are more able to take on responsibilities and engage in the global, in the conceptualization and delivery of global public goods. So that, I think, that credo of the global South has been to focus on interdependence, not dependency, on fairer, more just, more equitable, multilateral trading, financial and monetary systems and international order, and more beneficial win-win globalization. And by the way, globalization, I would say around 2000, historians of globalization would say around 2008-9, it became China-led globalization. And now we have reached a phase where there is a de-globalization movement, certainly even in the traditional bastions of and leaders of globalization. So this is, and then the ideology, or I would say the thought process of the global South has been to have genuine international cooperation on the selection and provisioning of global public goods and mitigating of global risks, and of course affecting all, and everyone must have a say in setting the rules for managing and delivering them, and insisting on participatory decision making. More adequate institutions, means, and this includes financial and technological, modalities and mechanisms, setting who does what, because this is a very important principle, each according to its capacity and weight for the benefit of all. In environment, we have the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. So that principle also the global South has been putting forward. So northern countries are expected to assume global leadership, embrace global solidarity, avoid global crisis, and not inflict global bads. Global bads are pollution, emission, wars, all the others. And provide a favorable external environment. That's the other thing. Favorable external environment for their sustainable development. So now I come to the multilateral system. What is the multilateral system? Multilateral system is anchored in the United Nations and includes first of all, the BWIs, the Bretton Woods institutions, which were founded around the same time, the World Bank and IMF, and the GATT then, which then became WTO. And there are something like a spaghetti bowl, if you will, of some 66 UN system organizations, agencies, entities, specialized agencies, and then, of course, related agencies, covering everything under the sun for global governance and for international cooperation, promoting international cooperation. Now, these were found, they marked 75 years in 2000. And that was the COVID year, the first global World War III type crisis that hit. And that not only killed 7 million people, I think last I counted, globally, but also devastated economies and societies, particularly in the developing countries. And that exposed the lack of international cooperation, the inability of WHO to forewarn, give the right cues for that it is reaching a pandemic state so that the world could be warned, and also not getting to the bottom of the origin of the virus, and getting affected by the powerful countries. So this was, and then the failure on vaccine equity. So, and TRIPS waiver, all of these, and also the economic collapse that happened, the the IMF and World Bank were not able to really come forward with the kind of help that the developing countries needed. So this was one crisis, a litmus test, and now we have Ukraine and the Ukraine-Russia conflict. And there we have a situation where, a Secretary General who had come with the mandate to prevent conflict, war, was unable to foresee or exercise any mediation before or after, and the UN Security Council was paralyzed because of the P2 and P3 division and exercise of veto. So all that the UN could do so far, which is, some of it is still valuable, is that it has been able to debate some of these issues, including on, the WMD, that is weapons of mass destruction, like biosecurity challenges or the nuclear challenges that are arising in this conflict, also arranging the grain deal or humanitarian corridor, etc. But there, it's 1 year on, and UN has not been, and so it has raised questions about the relevance and whether it will follow the fate of the League of Nations, its predecessor organization. Many of the former UN officials themselves wrote a letter to Mr. Guterres at that time. So, and then we had the Afghanistan debacle, a lightning takeover by Taliban, and it has created a major humanitarian and human rights crisis, which the UN is trying to pick up the pieces of. So now, it's been a fateful time then for the UN system, and I want to more broadly call it that, to really, in some ways, because 75 years completion you celebrate, and there have been many achievements in all these 4 projects that I've mentioned of the UN, which I don't have the time to set out, but all of you know. But also, more importantly, to introspect on what is missing, what is broken, what is dysfunctional, and how to fix it, and how to reform. So I think there has been a rethink, even in more conservative quarters, about how to approach reform of multilateralism. So let me say what ails multilateral institutions. Some general points, and then I'll come to specifics on one side, UN Security Council reform, and on the other side, I hope I have the time to do that, and your patience, I seek your patience, and on the other side, the BWIs. So let me first of all say, firstly, this whole system was created by the victors of World War II in 1945, when the membership of the UN was 51. We now have 194 members, and the structures of that post-World War II are still prevailing in terms of decision making and how the UN is run. So that itself cries out for change. The second thing is dysfunctional due to prolonged Cold War divisions over the years. Unipolar world from 1990, and now again the spectre of Cold War 2.0, emergence of the global south, and since 2009 onwards, as I mentioned, China-led globalization. Now China is the second pole, systemic, ideological, strategic, military competitor to Western liberal democracy, UN, member states, therefore face another challenge. It's riven. The system, the secretariat will be riven, and I know it from within. And of course, the member states will be riven and will be called upon to make choices. So that's the problem. Another problem, I mean. Many countries have moved from the periphery of the world, as I said, to the center, and yet the old center and multilateral institutions are structurally sclerotic. Procedures, processes are archaic, dysfunctional, legitimacy is being questioned, and then we have non-state actors. How do we include them in this whole thing? There are corporations that are bigger than countries and playing a very major role. Shape-shifting technologies, Tech 4.0, terrorists as non-state actors, new areas of governance like the blue economy and ocean governance, media, especially social media, and there has been a dispersal of its capabilities and responsibilities around the world. Now, there are many, many more countries who have the capabilities and who can assume responsibilities in decision making and in execution of global public good. So, and then new risks, you mentioned multidimensional, also phenomena that have multidimensional causes, multi-stakeholders, different technologies and consequences also are multidimensional. So when you look at all this, you cannot be stuck with an organization which is 1945, born 1945 and remains like that. The other aspect is the principle of sovereign equality of states, transparency and accountability has been flouted in key decision-making global governance institutions, structurally, but also informally, or through processes and procedures set by major powers, budget contributors, controlling states with control. And that's true of all. UN Security Council, BWIs. And in other organizations, as I gave you the example of WHO. So, it is indeed, and WTO is the trade share issue. So, what is necessary is therefore that we have to look at this whole issue of participative and equality of states and, participatory governance. Institutional capture. The question is, whose UN is it? For whose benefit, on whose behalf is it acting? Those questions shouldn't be asked because it's supposed to be impartial, supranational organization. But it is. And so this is something that we have, and WHO is a case in point again. So we have to take measures in order to make this organization something that whose partiality or whose independence will be ensured, but his partiality will not be questioned, or impartiality is taken. Then the secretariat. I think I have mentioned also already that the secretariat comes under the pressure of the major budget contributors, etc. And so there are many things that we need to fix there. Also how they work, transparency, so many other ways. Also geographical rotation in terms of leadership and geographical representation in terms of leadership. Because now there are these decided that so-and-so country will be heading this or that organization. So it's kind of prefixed. So we need to break away from that. Also specialized technical capacities which are globally recognized. People who have globally recognized capacities. And many cases, I know blue economy I've been looking at because of Ambassador Bhatia's, for example, the UN does not have its own expertise. It's looking at other member states giving its capacity. So secretariats must be fully not only empowered but enabled to have that capacity and capacitated. The elements of norm. So on the issue of UN Security Council reform, and I don't know whether the G20 outcome will deal with that. Quad has supported it very strongly. The Quad Foreign Ministers meeting has in fact endorsed UN Security Council reform. But it's a very important piece of the multilateralism, reformed multilateralism. And in that context, the foreign minister talked about the new orientation for reformed multilateralism or norm. And this involves increasing the number of permanent and non-permanent members of the Security Council and breaking that monopoly as well as the paralysis of the P5 being now P3 and P2. So you need a third pole, and you need, this has been going on, this reform proposal has been going on for 30 years without, and particularly the P5 have been resisting for various reasons, but also some have been, even trying to block the processes, a transparent process in the UNGA for negotiations. So we need to change that, and I hope these, World War III like crises that we are facing are going to bring about a change of heart and change of mind on this. Some of it has begun. There was this veto initiative which required the UNGA to look at every veto that was, exercised in the UN Security Council. So, it's not only India, but we have more than 5 billion people are left out of this whole calculus of peace and security project, including countries who will need support. Africa is out, Latin America and Caribbean is out, SIDS are out, a subcontinent is out, the South Asian subcontinent is out. So this cannot be. So this has to be changed, and it is also for bringing greater diversity of experience and wisdom, political sagacity, sustainability, effectiveness, quality of decision making, and of effective and salience of actions on the ground. Because this last part is also very important for peacekeeping. So those of you who have the military background would know that this will have an impact in terms of also bringing the ground level wisdom and experience of countries like India, but also other countries who should be there representing their continents to really bring that wisdom and effectiveness to the UN Security Council and break the logjam. And so that brings me to the veto question. So 5 countries having the veto and the others not, and then being able to block things, I think that also needs a rethink. Better calibrate the relative roles of the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council. Better codify and formalize and make more accountable the working methods, because these are in many times very opaque and behind the scenes, and its subsidiary bodies and other independent, and to have an independent and able secretariat. The issue of regular budget. I think financing overall is a major problem, because these are not well financed, stably financed. They become dependent on donors, particular donors and their agendas. So this has to change, and I'm particularly referring to the counter-terrorism architecture. It is really something that needs addressing. And by the way, in the peace and security calculus, we must include disarmament. I think you mentioned disarmament, and we must mention counterterrorism, because this is very much a part of the peace and security project. And then the role of regional organizations. Africa in particular has faced this issue of its regional organization not being empowered, not being funded, not being engaged to the extent that it could be, and enabled to the extent. So these are some of the ideas that can really make a big difference between being the multi, and the UN Security Council is the engine, the war room, the controlling tower, as I call it, of the peace and security mandate of the multilateral system. And it has the teeth. It can authorize economic sanctions under Article 41, and it can authorize military action against Article 42 on the basis of Article 42 of Chapter 7. But it will not be able to do that wisely, and also it's simply paralyzed because of the way it is structured and the geopolitics of it. So this is something that we have to take note of. Now, I want to also just briefly mention how we need to set certain criteria which are objective. The Sanctions Committee of the UN Security Council, for example, and I'm just quoting the Quad statement, says they are concerned at attempts to politicize the workings of the UN sanctions regime, and called on all states to maintain the objective and evidence-based working methods of the UN Security Council Sanctions Committee. So even the bodies, subsidiary bodies of the UN Security Council, they need to be put on an objective criteria basis. Now let me turn very quickly to the Bretton Woods institutions. There is a crisis of development finance. You mentioned SDGs. But what we have found, and that's what India has prioritized, those two elements, that is financing of SDGs and accelerating the implementation of SDGs, because we are at the midpoint and we are way lagging behind. We will not reach, the world will not reach the 2030 agenda targets. So we do need to really pump up on the financing of SDGs. The second is climate change action and financing of that. And then of course the recovery, the shock of the COVID, we have barely recovered, and then you have this conflict, Russia-Ukraine conflict. And so economies of developing countries are staggering from these multiple blows, and the 3F crisis: food, fuel, and fertilizer. Now, are our institutions really able to respond? They have not so far been able. So, can the G20 come together and give a big push to the reform of these institutions, creation of the kind of modalities and initiatives, funds that will really push this agenda and bring this agenda to fruition in terms of the promises that were made by the developed countries in the context of the Paris Agreement and also subsequent agreements, and in terms of climate, but also on SDGs. So, just very quickly, I would like to say that, just to draw your attention, because I think questions were raised about what is the Global South's concerns. So one is this, which I've mentioned, or two things I've mentioned, that how do you help them to go on the path of a decarbonized, development? So that is one, and the other is SDGs, and the third is how do you deal with the debt crisis? So debt crisis, if I can mention, that there are 75 developing countries who have a debt of $9 trillion. And the debt suspension initiative that was adopted in the 2020 G20 has, in fact, been dysfunctional because, one country, China, which is owed 30% of the debt of the developing countries, 47 countries owe China. So that China has not joined that initiative. So that is one issue, but also what more can be done to deal with this issue of the developing country debt, the global south debt. So one major issue in terms of the World Bank Group is recapitalization, particularly of the regional development banks. They don't have the funds. And now is the time that our regions, the Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Caribbean, the growth potential is tremendous. Urbanization is taking place. So here you need all the resources that you can get. But concessional finance is dipping by 21%. Philanthropy is going down by some 40%. So at a time like this, we really need to revisit the whole, design of what we are doing and the ambition of what we are to undertake. So reform of MIGA, IFC, so that private sector investment can be leveraged in developing countries, because and confidence given to private sector investors, and how public-private financing can be mutually leveraged. Also, the issue of the governance of the World Bank and the share of developing countries there. I don't want to go into there are many detailed issues that need to be addressed, but I'll now go into IMF quota and voice reforms. So one issue is that G20 presidency is taking place at a crucial juncture with respect to the voice and quota reforms to improve the legitimacy, representativeness, and efficacy of the IMF. Why do I say that? Because a new quota formula is for vote share has been mandated to be finalized by December 2023 as part of the 16th General Review of Quotas to increase the share of low income, and also this will, we hope, increase the share of low income and underrepresented countries. So India can get, we hope, the G20 to weigh in on this, conceptualizing on the guiding principles that resonate the needs of the global south in terms of IMF's vote share. Then the other issue about IMF, as you know, IMF has the power to issue the SDR, special drawing rights, in times of liquidity crisis, as happened during the COVID. And at that time, the IMF issued SDRs worth $655 billion, of which only $21 billion went to developing countries. That is 38 LDCs and 28 developing countries out of 655. And what is worse is that those, because of the way that this formula is, the share of SDR is issued, the developed countries did not use their share of SDRs. So we have to have now a relook at the way these SDRs are issued, the criteria for that, and if another country is not using it, whether it cannot be given to the developing countries. So these are some of the things that have to be addressed. And then the WTO, both in terms of, I think we really need to get the WTO, it's dysfunctional also in so many ways, and not only for the global south. But for the global south, we need to align the WTO to the SDGs. Why do I say that? For example, if we are talking about SDG on food security and agriculture, the agriculture agreement on agriculture of the WTO must reflect that. And of course, we have had this fisheries subsidy breakthrough, which is one of the SDGs on ocean development. But we have to have that aspect very well reflected in the WTO. And also transparency. I think this is not only a South issue. Everyone is asking for WTO's ability to enforce and to, first of all, monitor and surveil. I think this is a very important point, that the multilateral system's ability to surveil, which we saw in the case of the pandemic, WHO's capacity to surveil, multilateral surveillance mechanism, are weak or non-existent. So this is something that we have to also see in the context of trade. The third is the appellate body is, as you know, it needs to be restored. And also, of course, developing countries need to be supported in terms of. So we have, I think India has put forward a reform agenda and supported the reform agenda in the WTO. WHO reform also. We are now engaging in 2 processes in the WHO, and we are strongly calling for clear protocols that the WHO must follow when a health emergency arises and when it becomes a public health emergency of international concern. Because that's what didn't happen in time. And the world was caught unawares. And it spread like wildfire. So these are many of the institutions that need reform in different ways. So we know what is wrong, what is broken, what is dysfunctional and weak. But unfortunately, no consensus exists or can be mustered for reform, especially as we see this conflict coming up, the East-West divide, the North-South. We don't want it to be a divide, but still there are these North-South issues that we need to address, and India wants to be a bridging power, a bridging entity to bring about a more effective multilateralism. I think the geopolitical contestations and geo-economic turbulences are going to be at their peak, and they are at their peak. In one of my articles, I talked about, you said that there are many articles which have come on G20, but one of the articles I talked about and quoted, our British friends would bear with me, but I quoted Charles Dickens' The Best of Times and the Worst of Times. So these are those best of times and the worst of times from the perspective of India's G20 presidency and also for multilateralism. It is facing an existential crisis. Look at and G20 itself is evidence that, as you said, multilateralism is not delivering at certain levels. Minilaterals, plurilaterals. WTO, by the way, these days the only negotiations going on there are the plurilateral negotiations, which is a total, it is completely opposed to the concept of multilateralism, MFN treatment, and so on, and single undertaking. So these are challenges that are there. So unless multilateralism is revamped, overhauled, we are not going to have a multilateral system. If it is there, it will be only in name or will be on the fringe. Also, it has to meet with the new challenges and draw up the governance of many new things that are happening around us, technology-wise as well. So, we must keep alive the hope, and all of you who represent different countries who are, and I know all of you are very much committed to multilateralism and the projects that it represents and tries to keep forward. But each country individually and as an international community has to ignite the power to reform and build and renew. These are the three things: reform, build, and renew. That must be taken forward. And as you said, reforms cannot be put off without risking a continuing global conflagration. And, we are even, there are concerns even about a nuclear Armageddon. So we have to really step back and, see what is right for humanity. And also an irreversible economic meltdown that is seen to be happening, and climate change catastrophe, and failure to achieve the sustainable development goals, which are the lifeline for the survival of the human race. And I really want to emphasize that, because that's a very comprehensive goal setting, the 17 goals. Since we are here in the Vivekananda Institute, I would like to end with two quotes from Swami Vivekananda. And that, I think, the first quote represents India's spirit. Be the servant while leading. Be unselfish. Have infinite patience, and success is yours. And then he also said, humanism concerns with human interests and ideals. It affirms the supremacy of man and of reason. And I think both humanity and humanism and reason demand that we really build this renewed multilateralism, this reformed multilateralism, and rebuilt multilateralism together. And I think India is very much trying to do that with the support not only of G20 countries, but all the members of the international community. Thank you.